What does it feel like to be invited back into a world that already erased you, just to be reminded you no longer belong? Emily Carter stood at the edge of the glass-walled ballroom, the city of Manhattan glittering beneath her like a distant memory she was no longer part of. The air hummed with wealth, with polished laughter and curated perfection, a symphony of power she once moved through without thinking. Now, every step felt measured, every glance calculated. She had not always been an outsider here. There was a time when her name carried weight in rooms like this, when she stood beside Daniel Brooks not as an accessory, but as a foundation. Before the empire, before the headlines, before he decided she no longer fit the version of success he wanted the world to see. The invitation had arrived a week ago, printed on heavy cream paper, understated but deliberate. The annual charity gala. A place where reputations were reinforced and narratives rewritten. Her name was still on the list, not because she belonged, but because she had once mattered. She should have declined. That would have been easier, quieter, invisible, but something inside her refused. A quiet, steady defiance that had been growing in the silence of her smaller life. Because disappearing had been his version of closure, not hers. Across the room, Daniel stood exactly where she expected him to be. Center. Surrounded. Admired. His tuxedo perfectly tailored, his posture effortless, his smile the same one that used to feel like home and now felt like strategy. Beside him stood his new wife, radiant in a way that felt almost rehearsed. Younger. Brighter. A reflection of everything he had decided Emily was not. The contrast was intentional. It always had been. Emily watched as he leaned slightly toward a group of investors, his voice low but precise, controlling the rhythm of the conversation the way he always did. He had built more than a company. He had built a narrative. And in that narrative, she had been edited out. Not erased violently, just quietly replaced. It was cleaner that way. A server passed by, offering champagne. Emily took one, more for the illusion of belonging than the drink itself. The glass felt cold against her fingers, grounding. She could feel the weight of eyes occasionally drifting toward her. Some curious, some dismissive, most indifferent. It was not cruelty that defined this room. It was indifference. And somehow, that cut deeper. She had learned that the hard way. Months ago, in a small apartment that smelled faintly of old wood and radiator heat, she had sat alone, trying to understand how a life could collapse so quietly. No dramatic ending. No final confrontation. Just a slow, deliberate withdrawal of attention, of affection, of acknowledgement. Until one day, she was no longer part of the equation. Invisible. The memory flickered and faded as the music shifted, a subtle cue that something, or someone, important had entered the next phase of the evening. Emily exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She had not come here to relive that version of herself. She had come for a reason, even if no one else knew it yet. Across the room, Daniel's gaze swept the crowd with practiced ease. For a brief moment, it passed over her. No pause. No recognition. Just a flicker, as if she were part of the background. A stranger in a familiar space. It should have hurt more. But instead, something inside her settled. Calm. Controlled. Different. Because for the first time, she was not waiting for him to see her. She was waiting for something else entirely. And as the doors at the far end of the ballroom began to open, a subtle shift rippled through the crowd, barely noticeable, but real. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. The air changed. Emily did not look back immediately. She did not need to. She could feel it. The moment before everything breaks, or begins. And somewhere behind her, footsteps moved with quiet certainty toward the center of the room. Toward her. The shift in the room was subtle at first, like a change in pressure before a storm. Conversations softened, laughter clipped short, and a quiet ripple of attention moved toward the entrance, as if pulled by something unseen, but undeniable. Emily felt it before she saw it, a disturbance in the carefully controlled rhythm of the evening. She turned slowly, not with urgency, but with intention. Because whatever was happening, it was not accidental. At the far end of the ballroom, a man stepped inside, his presence cutting clean through the noise without demanding it. He was not loud. He did not need to be. Power rarely was. His suit was understated, dark, perfectly fitted in a way that spoke of precision, rather than display. But it was not the fabric that drew attention. It was the way people reacted. Heads turned. Shoulders straightened. Conversations recalibrated mid-sentence. The kind of reaction reserved for someone whose name carried weight far beyond the room. Emily's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her glass, not from nerves, but from recognition. Not of him. Not exactly. But of the shift he brought with him. This was not part of Daniel's script. Across the room, Daniel had noticed it too. His posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, his smile pausing just a fraction too long before resetting. He followed the direction of the crowd's attention, his confidence adjusting, recalculating. The man continued forward, unhurried, as if the room would naturally make space for him. And it did. Emily watched as pathways opened subtly in his wake, people stepping aside without being asked, as though instinct alone guided them. She should have felt out of place. Small. Disconnected. But instead, something else surfaced. A quiet steadiness. Because for the first time since she walked into that room, the focus was no longer on her absence. It was shifting toward something new. Daniel cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of his circle, drawing attention back to himself with a well-timed remark that earned a polite ripple of laughter. But it was thinner now, less certain. Even his new wife seemed distracted, her gaze drifting toward the man at the entrance, curiosity replacing the practiced poise she had worn all evening. Emily took a slow sip of champagne, her eyes never leaving the approaching figure. There was something deliberate in his movement. Not random, not curious, directed. And then, without announcement, without introduction, his gaze found her. It was not a searching glance. It was precise, intentional, as if he had known exactly where she would be standing all along. The moment stretched, quiet and electric. Emily felt the weight of it, the way the air seemed to hold its breath. For a second, the past flickered, memories of being overlooked, dismissed, erased. But they did not anchor her anymore. They passed through her, leaving something stronger in their wake. Because this time, she was not the one being ignored. He changed direction. Subtly, but unmistakably. Not toward the center. Not toward Daniel. Toward her. A whisper moved through the nearest clusters of guests, curiosity sharpening into something more focused. People noticed. Of course they did. In a room like this, attention was currency. And suddenly, she had it. Daniel followed the shift, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tracked the man's path. Confusion flickered across his expression, quickly masked but not fully hidden. This was not how the evening was supposed to unfold. This was not the narrative he had prepared. Emily placed her glass down on a nearby tray, her movements calm, unhurried. She could feel the weight of the room beginning to tilt, the invisible hierarchy adjusting in real time. It was subtle, but it was happening. The man stopped a few steps in front of her, close enough that the ambient noise faded into the background, replaced by a quieter, more focused tension. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. He studied her, not with curiosity, but with recognition. As if she were not a stranger. As if she had never been invisible at all. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. Because whatever came next, she had already chosen not to step back. And somewhere behind them, the room leaned in, waiting. Because something was about to happen. And everyone could feel it. The silence between them did not feel empty. It felt charged, like the moment before a decision is made that cannot be undone. Emily held his gaze, steady, unreadable, while the room around them slowly recalibrated, attention tightening into a single point. People were watching now. Not casually. Not politely. Intently. Because something about this moment did not fit the expected script. The man inclined his head slightly, a gesture so subtle it might have been missed by anyone not looking directly at him. But Emily noticed. Of course she did. "You made it," he said, his voice low, controlled, carrying just enough to reach her and no one else. It was not a question. It was a confirmation. Emily felt the words settle, precise and deliberate. "I said I would," she replied, her tone calm, almost quiet, but anchored with something that had not been there before. Certainty. A flicker of recognition passed through his expression, not surprise, but approval. As if this version of her matched exactly what he expected. Behind them, the murmurs began to sharpen. Names were being whispered now, quickly, discreetly, as people tried to place him, to understand why the room had shifted so completely in his presence. And then it happened. One name surfaced, louder than the rest, carried just enough to ripple outward. Alexander Hayes. The reaction was immediate. Not dramatic, but unmistakable. Subtle straightening of posture. Quick exchanges of glances. The kind of recognition that did not need explanation. Influence. Power. Control. Across the room, Daniel heard it too. Emily saw it in the way his expression changed, the brief fracture in his composure before he masked it again. He knew the name. Of course he did. Everyone in his world did. And suddenly, the distance between them, the carefully maintained separation, felt thinner, less secure. Daniel's attention locked onto the scene unfolding before him. Calculation replacing confidence as he tried to understand the connection. Because there was a connection, it was impossible to ignore now. Alexander took one step closer, closing the remaining distance with effortless precision. He did not touch her. Not yet. But the proximity alone was enough to redraw the lines of the room. Emily could feel it, the shift in how people were looking at her now. Not through her. At her. The invisible woman had become the center of something they did not yet understand. "They've been waiting to see you," he said softly, his gaze flicking briefly toward the crowd before returning to her. Emily allowed herself the smallest exhale, not relief, but release. Because this moment, this exact moment, had been building long before she stepped into the gala. It was never about proving anything to Daniel. Not really. It was about reclaiming something that had been quietly taken from her piece by piece. Presence. Identity. Power. And now, the room was watching it happen. Daniel moved then. Finally, drawn by something he could no longer ignore. He approached with measured steps, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes sharp, searching. His new wife followed half a step behind. Her earlier confidence, softened by uncertainty, she could not fully hide. They stopped a few feet away, close enough to be part of the moment, but not yet inside it. Not in control of it. "Alexander," Daniel said, his voice smooth, practiced, extending a hand as if this were a standard introduction, as if he still dictated the terms of every interaction in this room. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight." Alexander's gaze shifted to him, cool, assessing, the faintest pause before he responded. He did not take the hand. Not immediately. The silence stretched just long enough to be noticed. Just long enough to matter. "I go where I'm needed," Alexander replied, his tone even, almost indifferent. Then, without looking away from Daniel, he added, "And tonight, I am." The words landed heavier than they sounded, because everyone understood what they implied. Daniel's hand lowered slowly, the first visible crack in his control. He turned, just slightly, gesturing toward Emily with a polite, dismissive smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "I see you've met my ex-wife," he said, the word ex carrying the weight of finality, of dismissal, of everything he believed she still was. Emily felt the old version of herself flicker at the edge of that label. The one who would have shrunk, explained, apologized for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. But that version of her was gone. Quietly. Completely. Alexander's expression did not change. But something in the air did. He turned then, fully this time, his attention shifting from Daniel back to her. And in that simple movement, the hierarchy of the room adjusted again. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. He closed the final inch of space between them, his presence now unmistakably aligned with hers. And then, for the first time, his hand lifted, not to claim, not to display, but to rest lightly at the small of her back. Protective, certain, intentional. A collective breath seemed to catch in the room. Because whatever this was, it was no longer ambiguous. And Daniel saw it. The shift, the alignment, the thing he could not control. Emily did not look away. She did not step back. Because this was the moment he had never imagined. The moment where she was no longer part of his past, but the center of something far beyond it. And the worst part? This was only the beginning. The contact was minimal, barely there, but it was enough to fracture the illusion Daniel had spent months constructing. Alexander's hand rested at the small of Emily's back with quiet certainty, not possessive, not performative, but intentional in a way that did not ask for permission. The gesture alone said more than words ever could, and the room understood. A subtle shift rippled outward, faster now, sharper. Conversations did not just pause, they recalibrated. Eyes that had once skimmed past Emily now lingered, reassessing, recalculating her position. In a hierarchy that was no longer fixed. She felt it without turning. The weight of attention had changed. It was no longer curiosity. It was recognition. Daniel saw it too. Of course he did. His jaw tightened, just slightly, the only visible sign that something had slipped beyond his control. He had built his world on precision, on narrative dominance, on always being the one who defined reality before anyone else could question it. But this was not part of his design. I wasn't aware you two knew each other, Daniel said, his tone still smooth, but now edged with something colder, something sharper beneath the surface. A test. A probe. A way to regain footing. Alexander did not rush to answer. He let the silence stretch again, deliberate, controlled, allowing the discomfort to settle into the space between them. It was not cruelty. It was strategy. There are many things you weren't aware of, Alexander replied evenly, his voice low but carrying just enough to reach the nearest circle of listeners. Not loud. Never loud. Power did not need volume. The words landed with precision, cutting clean through the thin layer of politeness Daniel was trying to maintain. A faint murmur moved through the surrounding guests, the tension sharpening into something almost tangible. Daniel's new wife shifted beside him, her earlier composure faltering for the first time, her gaze flicking between Emily and Alexander as if trying to solve a puzzle that refused to resolve. Emily remained still, grounded, aware of every movement, every glance, every shift in energy around her. This was not chaos. It was alignment. For months, she had been reduced to a memory, a footnote in someone else's story. Now, without raising her voice, without demanding attention, she had become the axis everything was turning around. Emily, Daniel said, finally directing his attention to her fully, his voice softening just enough to suggest familiarity, to reclaim some version of their past in front of an audience. I didn't expect to see you here tonight. It sounded polite, almost warm, but beneath it was the same quiet dismissal, the same assumption that she was still operating within the limits he had defined for her. Emily met his gaze, steady, unshaken. That seems to be a pattern with you, she said calmly. No accusation, no raised tone, just a simple statement. And somehow that made it heavier. The surrounding silence deepened, the kind that did not come from absence, but from anticipation. Because everyone could feel it now. This was no longer a polite exchange. This was a shift in power happening in real time. Daniel's smile faltered, just for a second, before resetting again, thinner this time, less convincing. Well, he said, glancing briefly at Alexander before returning his focus to Emily. I hope life has been treating you well. The pause before well was intentional. A reminder. A subtle attempt to pull her back into the role he had assigned her. The one where she was smaller. Lesser. Left behind. Emily felt the echo of that version of herself. The one who might have accepted that framing. Who might have softened, explained, justified her existence. But that version had been dismantled long before tonight. Piece by piece. Quietly. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable, almost thoughtful. It has, she replied. Simple. Controlled. Final. No elaboration. No need. Because the proof was already standing beside her. Alexander's presence did not dominate the moment. It anchored it. He did not interrupt. He did not correct. He allowed her to speak, to define herself, to take the space that had once been denied to her. And that, more than anything, shifted the balance further. Daniel noticed. His eyes flickered again, sharper now, more focused, as if he were trying to reconstruct the situation in real time, to find the angle where he still held control. But the variables had changed, and he was just beginning to understand how much. You've certainly kept interesting company, Daniel said, nodding slightly toward Alexander, the attempt at casual observation falling just short of neutral. It was not a compliment. It was a challenge disguised as one. Emily did not answer immediately. She let the silence hold for a beat, just long enough to shift the weight of the question back onto him. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but unwavering. I've learned to choose better. The words landed clean. No hesitation. No apology. A ripple moved through the crowd, subtle but undeniable, as the implication settled into place. Daniel's expression tightened, the edges of his composure beginning to fray. Because for the first time since she had walked into that room, he was no longer dictating the narrative. He was reacting to it, and the room could see it. Emily felt it too. The shift was no longer gradual. It was visible now, tangible. The hierarchy he had built was not collapsing loudly. It was dissolving quietly, right in front of him. And the worst part? There was nothing he could do to stop it. Because this moment was not about confrontation. It was about contrast. And for the first time, she was the one who held the power. Power did not arrive all at once. It revealed itself in fragments, in glances, in silence, in the way a room slowly decided who mattered. Emily could feel it now, settling into place around her, no longer fragile, no longer uncertain. It was not loud. It did not demand attention. It simply existed. And because of that, it could not be ignored. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, the movement subtle but telling, as if the ground beneath him had become less stable than he expected. His world had always been structured, predictable, built on control and perception. But this moment, this was something else. Something he had not accounted for. "I see," he said, his voice measured, though the edges were beginning to sharpen. "So this is your new chapter." The way he said it carried a quiet skepticism, a final attempt to frame the situation within terms he could still dominate. A temporary alignment. A coincidence. Something explainable. Something dismissible. Emily held his gaze, unblinking, unhurried. "No," she said softly. "This is what was always there. You just never looked." The words did not rise. They did not cut, but they landed deeper than anything louder could have. A flicker passed through Daniel's expression, recognition quickly buried. Because somewhere, beneath the control, beneath the ego, he understood exactly what she meant. He had not lost her. He had overlooked her. And that realization was far more dangerous. Around them, the crowd had grown quieter, the circle tightening almost unconsciously as people leaned into the moment, drawn not by drama, but by the subtle shift in power unfolding before them. This was not spectacle. This was recalibration. Alexander remained beside her, still, composed, his presence no longer an interruption, but a constant. He did not speak. He did not need to. His silence was not absence. It was confirmation, and everyone in the room could read it. Daniel's wife stepped forward slightly, reclaiming space that had begun to slip from her. Grasp, her smile carefully reconstructed, though now it carried an edge of strain. "Well," she said lightly, her tone polished but thinner than before. "It's certainly impressive. Some people do manage to reinvent themselves." The implication hung in the air, delicate but deliberate. Reinvention. As if Emily's presence required explanation. As if her value was newly acquired rather than always there. Emily turned her gaze to her, calm, almost curious, studying her not as a rival, but as a reflection of something she had already outgrown. "Some people," Emily replied evenly, "just stop pretending they need permission." The silence that followed was sharper this time, cleaner, because the line had been drawn. Not aggressively, not dramatically, but clearly. Daniel exhaled slowly, his patience thinning, the carefully constructed facade beginning to fracture under pressure he could not fully contain. "You're making quite a statement tonight," he said, his tone tightening just enough to betray the control he was losing. "I didn't realize that was your intention." Emily let a faint, almost imperceptible smile touch her lips. Not triumphant, not mocking, just certain. "I didn't come to make a statement," she said. "I came to stop being one." The words shifted something again, because for months, years, she had been a story told by others. A quiet wife, a discarded past, a mistake corrected. But now, she was no longer defined by how she was seen. She was defining it herself. Daniel's gaze flickered briefly to Alexander, searching, calculating, trying to understand the depth of the connection standing in front of him. "And you," Daniel said, redirecting his attention, his voice cooling as he addressed Alexander directly. "You always involve yourself in personal matters like this?" It was a challenge, a final attempt to reassert territory, to draw lines, to force a boundary where he could still claim authority. Alexander's expression remained unchanged, composed, almost indifferent, but there was something beneath it now. Not anger, not irritation, something steadier, something absolute. He looked at Daniel for a moment, then shifted his gaze back to Emily, as if the answer did not belong to him alone. Then, finally, he spoke. "Only when it matters," he said quietly. And in that single sentence, everything aligned. Because it was not just a response. It was a declaration. A confirmation of value, of priority, of choice. The room felt it. The weight of it settled into the space. Undeniable. Daniel did not respond immediately. For the first time since the conversation began, he had nothing prepared. No angle. No narrative. Just the reality unfolding in front of him, outside his control. Emily could see it clearly now. The shift was complete. Not explosive. Not dramatic. But irreversible. The man who had once defined her place in the world was now standing on the edge of something he could not control. And the room, his room, was watching it happen. Quietly. Intently. Because this was no longer about who she used to be. It was about who she had become. And for the first time, everyone could see it. The balance of the room had shifted, but power did not settle quietly without resistance. It pressed, it tested, it forced the moment to reveal what it truly was. Emily could feel that pressure now, subtle but insistent, like the final seconds before something irreversible happened. The air was no longer just charged. It was expectant. Daniel straightened slightly, reclaiming what composure he could, the instinct to regain control rising fast beneath the surface. He had built his entire life on recovery, on turning moments like this into advantages, on rewriting narratives before they could define him. And he was not finished. Not yet. Well, he said, his voice smoother now, recalibrated, the practiced confidence returning in measured layers. It seems I underestimated you. The words sounded almost like acknowledgement, almost like respect, but beneath them was something else. A quiet attempt to reposition himself, to suggest that her presence, her shift, still existed within his frame of reference. Something he had simply failed to predict. Emily heard it clearly. The implication, the reduction. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with a calm that did not invite interruption. You didn't underestimate me, she said softly. You just stopped paying attention. The correction was precise. Not emotional. Not defensive. Just true. And truth, delivered without urgency, had a way of landing harder than anything else. A faint ripple moved through the surrounding guests, the tension tightening again, sharper this time, because the lines were no longer subtle. They were defined. Daniel's expression hardened, just slightly, the mask slipping for a fraction of a second before resetting again. But it was enough. The room noticed. His wife stepped in again, more firmly this time, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a gesture meant to stabilize, to reclaim some version of control in front of an audience that was no longer entirely theirs. I think what Daniel means, she said, her voice polished but carrying a faint edge, is that it's impressive how far you've come. The phrasing was careful, complimentary on the surface, but beneath it, there was still hierarchy, still distance, still the assumption that Emily's value was something recently acquired, something granted by circumstance rather than inherent. Emily's gaze softened, not in weakness, but in clarity, because she recognized it now. That tone, that framing. She had lived inside it for years. I didn't come far, she replied gently. I just stopped staying where I wasn't seen. The words settled into the space, quiet and unshakable. Another shift, another fracture in the structure Daniel had built. Because this was no longer about comparison. It was about perspective. And hers had changed completely. Daniel exhaled through his nose, a subtle sign of irritation breaking through his control, his patience thinning as the narrative slipped further from his grasp. And now, he asked, his voice tightening despite his efforts to keep it steady. You walk into a room like this with him and expect everyone to just what? Accept it. There it was. Not the composed businessman. Not the curated image. But the man who needed the room to confirm his version of reality. Who needed acknowledgement to validate control. Emily held his gaze, unwavering. I don't expect anything, she said. That's the difference. The simplicity of it disrupted everything. Because expectation implied dependence. And she no longer had any. The silence that followed was deeper now, heavier, the kind that did not just hold attention, it held judgment. And not of her, of him. Alexander shifted slightly beside her, not stepping forward, not dominating, but aligning more visibly now, his presence no longer just support, but statement. His hand remained at her back, steady, grounding, an unspoken confirmation that this was not temporary, not circumstantial, intentional. Daniel noticed. Of course he did. His eyes dropped briefly to the gesture before lifting again, something sharper now, something closer to realization. Not just of the connection, but of what it meant. "You're serious," Daniel said quietly, the words slipping out before he could reshape them into something more controlled. It was not a question. It was recognition. Emily did not hesitate. "Yes." One word. Final. And in that moment, the room understood something Daniel was only just beginning to grasp. This was not a performance, not a reaction, not a calculated move to provoke him. This was a shift that had already happened long before tonight. He was simply witnessing it too late. Daniel's posture changed again, the confidence no longer returning as easily, the edges of his control beginning to blur into something else. Something unfamiliar. Because for the first time in a long time, he was not the one deciding how this moment would end. And the room knew it. They could feel it in the way the energy had turned, in the way attention no longer revolved around him, but around the woman he had once dismissed as insignificant. Emily Carter was no longer standing at the edge of the room. She was standing at its center, and there was nothing he could do to move her. The room had stopped pretending this was a casual exchange. What had begun as a quiet tension was now something sharper, more defined, like a fault line finally breaking through the surface. Emily could feel it in the stillness around her, in the way conversations had not resumed, in the way every glance now carried weight. This was no longer about curiosity. This was about witnessing. Daniel stood there, no longer centered, no longer untouchable, his composure held together by habit more than certainty. And for the first time, that difference was visible. He let out a slow breath, as if recalibrating again, but this time the adjustment did not land as cleanly. "You've changed," he said, his voice quieter now, less performative, more personal. It was not framed as an accusation. Not exactly, but there was something underneath it, something closer to disbelief. Emily considered him for a moment, not with nostalgia, not with resentment, but with a clarity that felt almost detached. "No," she replied softly. "I just stopped shrinking." The words settled between them, not heavy, not dramatic, but final in a way that left no space for reinterpretation. A faint shift moved through the crowd again, not as sharp as before, but deeper. Because this was no longer about power alone. It was about perspective, and hers had become unrecognizable to him. Daniel's gaze lingered on her, searching for something familiar, something he could still identify, still categorize, still control. But what he found instead was distance. Not physical distance. Something more absolute. The kind that could not be closed by proximity or memory. His wife tightened her hold on his arm, subtle but deliberate, her posture straightening as if to reassert their position in a room that was no longer responding to them the same way. "Well," she said lightly, though the effort behind it was now visible, "people do evolve. Some more dramatically than others." The comment was polished, but it carried an edge, a last attempt to reframe Emily's transformation as something external, something dependent, something less authentic. Emily turned her gaze toward her again, calm, almost reflective. "It's not dramatic," she said. "It's just honest." The simplicity of it disarmed the tone completely, because honesty did not require validation. It did not compete. It simply existed. Daniel's expression shifted again, the subtle fractures deepening, his control no longer masking the realization forming beneath it. He glanced briefly at Alexander, then back at Emily, as if trying to align the two into something that made sense within his understanding. "And this," he said, gesturing slightly between them, "this is honesty?" The question was sharper now, less controlled, more personal than anything he had said so far. Emily did not rush to answer. She let the silence hold, not as avoidance, but as space. Then she spoke, her voice steady, grounded. "This is choice." The word landed with quiet precision. Because choice implied agency. It implied intention. It implied that she was no longer reacting to him, no longer shaped by his decisions, but operating entirely on her own terms. Alexander's hand shifted slightly at her back, not tightening, not claiming, but reinforcing that alignment. Not ownership, partnership. The distinction mattered, and the room could feel it. Daniel swallowed, the motion small but visible, his certainty slipping further as the dynamic continued to unfold beyond his reach. "I didn't think you," he began, then stopped, the sentence unraveling before he could finish it. Emily tilted her head slightly, a faint trace of curiosity in her expression. "Didn't think I what?" she asked, not pressing, not challenging, simply inviting the truth he was struggling to articulate. Daniel hesitated, and that hesitation said everything. Because for a man who had always been so precise, so controlled, so deliberate with his words, silence was a rare thing. That you would move on. Like this, he finished, the words quieter now, stripped of their earlier certainty. There it was. Not anger, not dominance, but something else, something closer to realization, maybe even regret. Emily studied him for a moment, seeing him not as the man who had defined her past, but as someone separate from it, smaller than he had once seemed. Not in status, in perspective. "I didn't move on," she said gently. "I moved forward." The distinction was subtle, but it changed everything, because moving on suggested leaving something behind. Moving forward meant carrying the lesson, the growth, the transformation into something new. And that was something he could not follow. The silence that followed was different now. Not tense, not sharp, but settled. Because the shift had already happened. The outcome was no longer in question. Around them, the room began to breathe again, softly, cautiously, as if unsure whether the moment had truly ended or was simply transitioning into something else. But the attention did not leave. It lingered. Because what they had just witnessed was not a confrontation. It was a redefinition. And at the center of it, Emily stood unchanged in her calm, unchanged in her certainty, but entirely transformed in how the world now saw her. Daniel looked at her one last time, longer this time, as if trying to reconcile the version of her he had known with the one standing in front of him now. But the two did not align. They could not. Because the woman he had dismissed no longer existed. And the one who replaced her was someone he had never truly understood. And now, finally, he was beginning to see what that had cost him. The room had not returned to normal. It only pretended to. Conversations resumed in fragments, quieter now, more cautious, like people speaking around something they could not unsee. Emily could feel it in the background. The shift had settled, but it had not faded. It lingered, woven into every glance, every recalibrated interaction. Because once power is revealed, it cannot be forgotten. Daniel remained where he stood, but he was no longer anchored. The certainty that once defined him had thinned into something less stable, something reactive. He adjusted his cuff, a small, controlled movement, but it came a fraction too late, as if he were catching up to a version of himself that had already slipped. "You always were good at this," he said finally, his tone attempting neutrality, though it carried something quieter beneath it. Not admiration, not quite resentment, something closer to reluctant recognition. Emily's gaze rested on him, steady, unguarded. "No," she said softly. "I just stopped being afraid of it." The words landed differently now, because fear had been the invisible thread that once held her in place. And its absence changed everything. Daniel gave a faint, almost humorless exhale, his eyes drifting briefly toward the crowd before returning to her. He could feel it too, the shift in how people were looking at him. Not openly, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to register. His wife stepped closer, her presence more deliberate now, her hand tightening slightly at his arm, as if reinforcing a position that was no longer naturally held. "Daniel," she said lightly, though the tension beneath it was unmistakable, "we're being watched." It was meant as a reminder, a correction, a call to return to the version of themselves that belonged here. But the irony lingered, because they had always been watched. They just had not realized how quickly that gaze could turn. Daniel nodded once, subtle, controlled, but his attention did not fully leave Emily. It lingered, pulled by something unresolved, something he could not neatly categorize or dismiss. "Of course," he said, his voice smoothing again, though not completely. Never completely. He turned slightly, addressing the nearest cluster of guests with a practiced ease, offering a remark that drew a small ripple of polite laughter. But it did not hold. Not the way it used to. The attention fractured, split, returned. Emily noticed. She did not need to look directly to feel it. Because for the first time, he was not the center of his own room. Alexander shifted beside her, just slightly, his posture unchanged but his awareness precise. "This won't stay quiet," he said under his breath, his voice low enough that only she could hear. It was not a warning. It was an observation. Emily allowed herself the smallest nod. It wasn't meant to, she replied. And that was the truth of it. This moment had never been about confrontation. It had been about exposure. Not of secrets. Of reality. And reality, once seen clearly, had a way of spreading. Across the room, more people were watching now. Not just glancing. Watching. Conversations slowed. Names were being exchanged again. More openly this time. The earlier whispers sharpening into something more direct. Recognition was no longer private. It was becoming collective. Daniel felt it. The shift from control to observation. From authority to scrutiny. And for someone like him, that change was not minor. It was structural. He turned back toward Emily again, his composure now held together by intention rather than instinct. "You've made your point," he said, his voice quieter, more contained, as if trying to bring the moment to a close on terms he could still define. Emily met his gaze, calm, unshaken. "I didn't come here to make a point," she said. "I came here so you could finally see one." The distinction settled heavily between them, because this was no longer about proving anything. It was about acknowledgement. An acknowledgement, once given, could not be taken back. Daniel held her gaze for a moment longer, something unreadable passing through his expression before it stilled again. "Not gone. Just contained." "I see," he said finally. But the words felt incomplete. Because seeing was not the same as understanding. And understanding was not the same as accepting. Emily could tell. He had seen the shift. He had felt it. But he had not yet grasped what it meant. Not fully. Not yet. And that was where the real fracture began. Around them, the room continued its quiet recalibration, the hierarchy no longer fixed, the lines no longer clear. Because the woman who had once been invisible was now impossible to ignore. And the man who had once defined her place in the world was now standing just outside of it. Not excluded, but no longer central. Emily felt the moment settle, not as an ending, but as a transition. Because something had changed tonight. Something permanent. Something visible. And as the attention of the room slowly expanded outward again, carrying the story beyond this single exchange, one truth remained steady beneath it all. This was not where it ended. It was where it began. The room had moved on. Or at least, it pretended to. Glasses clinked again, soft laughter resurfaced, conversations resumed in careful layers, but none of it felt the same. Because once a narrative breaks, it does not quietly repair itself. It fractures. And everyone remembers where they were when it happened. Emily stood where she was. No longer at the edge, no longer adjusting herself to fit the space. The space had adjusted to her. It was subtle, but undeniable. People approached differently now. Not with dismissal. Not even with curiosity. With awareness. The kind reserved for someone whose position had shifted beyond assumption. Alexander's presence beside her remained steady, but it no longer carried the need to prove anything. It had already done that. Now it simply existed, anchored, certain, unshakable. "You handled that well," he said quietly, his voice calm, observational. Not praise. Recognition. Emily exhaled softly, her gaze drifting briefly across the room, taking in the movement, the recalibration, the quiet aftermath of what had just unfolded. "It wasn't about handling it," she replied. "It was about ending it." Alexander studied her for a moment, something thoughtful passing through his expression. "Most people don't know when something is over," he said. Emily allowed the faintest hint of a smile. "Most people are waiting for permission." The words lingered between them, quiet but complete. Because that was the difference. She was no longer waiting. Across the room, Daniel had not left. That, more than anything, revealed the tension he was still carrying. A man like him did not retreat easily. He recalculated. He repositioned. He tried to regain ground, even when the structure beneath him had already shifted. Emily could see it in the way he moved now, less fluid, more deliberate. Every interaction slightly more controlled than necessary. Every glance measured. He was rebuilding something. Or trying to. His wife remained close, her posture still composed, but the earlier certainty had been replaced with something sharper, more guarded. She spoke more now, filling space, directing attention, attempting to restore the rhythm they had lost. It worked, partially, but not completely, because attention, once divided, rarely returns in full. Emily watched it all without urgency, without attachment. That, perhaps, was the most significant change of all. There was no need to win anything. No need to prove anything further. The shift had already happened, and it had not required force, only presence. A man approached then, older, composed, his expression carrying the careful neutrality of someone used to navigating power without aligning too quickly. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone respectful, measured. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." Emily turned to him, calm, receptive, no longer bracing for dismissal. "We haven't," she said. "But I imagine that's changing." A flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, crossed his expression. "It tends to," he replied. The exchange was brief, simple, but it carried weight, because it was not about the introduction itself. It was about acknowledgement. Public, undeniable. Nearby, others began to follow. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually. One conversation leading to another. One name exchanged, then another. The circle around her expanded, not because she sought it, but because it formed naturally, organically, as if the room had collectively decided to adjust its understanding of where she stood. Daniel saw it. Of course he did. Emily caught the moment his gaze locked onto the growing circle around her, the subtle tightening of his expression as the reality settled further in. This was not temporary. This was not a moment that would fade by the end of the night. This was a shift that would carry beyond this room, beyond this event, into every conversation that followed, into every room they would both walk into after tonight. And that was something he could not control. He started toward her again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if aware that the ground had changed and any misstep would be visible. His wife hesitated for a fraction of a second before following, her earlier confidence now replaced with a sharper kind of awareness. They approached the edge of her new circle, not entering immediately, not interrupting, but waiting to be acknowledged. And that was the shift. Emily felt it clearly. The reversal. The man who had once decided when she was seen was now waiting for her attention. Not demanding it. Waiting. She let the moment hold. Not to punish. Not to perform. But to acknowledge the truth of it. Then, slowly, she turned toward him. Not as someone returning to the past, but as someone entirely outside of it. And in that simple movement, the final line was drawn. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But permanently. Because this was no longer his narrative. And it never would be again. The pause before she acknowledged him was not hesitation. It was control. Emily turned toward Daniel with the same calm precision she had carried all evening. But now the shift was complete. He was no longer approaching from a position of dominance. He was stepping into her space, her orbit, her moment. And the room could feel it. Conversations slowed again, not out of obligation, but because something quieter and more significant was unfolding beneath the surface. Daniel stopped just within reach of the circle, his posture measured, his expression carefully neutral, but there was no mistaking the recalibration happening behind his eyes. This was unfamiliar territory, not because of Alexander, not because of the room, but because of her. "Emily," he said, her name softer now, stripped of the earlier edge, almost as if he were testing how it sounded without control attached to it. It lingered between them for a second, unfamiliar in its own way. Emily held his gaze, steady, unreadable. Daniel. No warmth. No coldness. Just acknowledgement. Balanced. Equal. And that alone shifted something further. He glanced briefly at the people around her, the subtle recognition passing through his expression as he registered the difference. These were not the same looks she had received earlier. Not the same distance. Not the same dismissal. This was engagement. Respect. Attention. And none of it came from him. "It seems like you've found your place," he said, the words chosen carefully, but the meaning beneath them less stable than he intended. It was not quite a compliment. Not quite a concession. More like an attempt to understand something he could no longer define. Emily tilted her head slightly, considering him with a calm that did not invite interruption. "No," she said quietly. "I stopped waiting for one." The distinction landed clean, because finding a place implied it had always been somewhere external. Something to be granted. Something to be earned. But she had stepped outside that entire structure. And he was only just beginning to see it. Daniel exhaled slowly, the movement controlled but heavier now, his composure no longer effortless. "You always had a way of reframing things," he said, almost to himself, though loud enough to be heard. It was meant to ground him, to pull the moment back into something familiar, something he could analyze. But even that felt thinner now. less certain. Emily's gaze did not shift. No, she said again, her voice steady. I just see them clearly now. Around them, the circle remained quiet, attentive, the people closest no longer pretending disinterest. This was no longer just a personal exchange. It was a moment of definition, and everyone understood it. Daniel's wife stepped slightly forward again, her presence more restrained this time. Her confidence no longer leading, but following. I think what Daniel is trying to say, she began, her tone controlled, carefully polished, is that it's admirable how you've managed to position yourself so well. The phrasing was subtle, but the implication remained. Position, as if Emily's presence was strategic, as if it required explanation, as if it still depended on external alignment. Emily looked at her, not dismissive, not confrontational, but clear. I didn't position myself, she said. I stopped letting others do it for me. The words settled, precise and final. No room for reinterpretation. No space for negotiation. A quiet ripple moved through the group, not dramatic, but undeniable. Because clarity, when delivered without force, carried its own weight. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, the reaction quick, almost instinctive, before he smoothed it away again. But it was enough. Enough to show that the balance had shifted beyond recovery. You've made your point, he said again, but this time the words lacked authority. They sounded less like a conclusion, and more like a request. Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, not unkind, not soft, just certain. No, she said. You just finally heard it. The silence that followed was complete. Not tense, not uncertain, just clear. Because this was no longer about winning, or losing, or proving anything at all. This was about recognition. And recognition, once it arrived, could not be undone. Daniel looked at her, really looked this time, without assumption, without narrative, without control. And what he saw was not the woman he had left behind. Not the version of her he had reduced, dismissed, replaced. He saw someone else entirely. Someone he had never taken the time to understand. And now, he had no choice but to. The realization settled slowly, visibly, reshaping something in his expression that could not be hidden anymore. Not shock, not anger, something quieter, something heavier. And for the first time that night, he did not speak. Because there was nothing left to say that would return him to where he had been. Emily felt it too. The final shift. Not explosive, not dramatic, but absolute. The moment where the past no longer held any authority over the present. And as the room continued to watch, quietly, attentively, one truth settled into place with complete certainty. This was no longer a confrontation. It was a conclusion. And she was the one who had written it. The room did not just watch anymore. It leaned in. What had been a quiet shift was now reaching something sharper, something undeniable, like the final turn of a key in a lock that had been resisting all night. Emily could feel it in the stillness that followed her last words. In the way even the smallest movements seemed louder now, more deliberate, more exposed. This was no longer about perception. This was about truth, public, visible, irreversible. Daniel stood there, facing her, but something fundamental had changed. The man who once controlled every room he entered was no longer setting the tone. He was reacting to it, adjusting to it, and the room could see it clearly. His silence stretched longer than expected, no quick recovery, no smooth redirection. Just a pause that felt unfamiliar on him. Heavy, real. He began, then stopped, the word dissolving before it could form into something controlled. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but for someone like Daniel, that hesitation was everything. Emily did not interrupt. She did not rush to fill the space. She let it exist. Because for the first time, he was the one without the next move. A faint murmur rippled outward, not loud, not chaotic, but enough to signal that the moment had crossed a threshold. People were no longer just observing. They were interpreting, reframing, rewriting what they thought they knew. Alexander shifted slightly beside her, his presence steady, but now more defined in its intent. His hand remained at her back, not claiming attention, but reinforcing alignment in a way that could not be misunderstood. And then, without raising his voice, without seeking permission from the room, he spoke. "There's something you should clarify," Alexander said, his tone calm, controlled, but carrying effortlessly across the space. It was not directed at Emily. It was directed at Daniel. The shift was immediate. Subtle, but absolute. Because now, the conversation had moved beyond personal history. It had entered something larger. Daniel's gaze flicked to him, sharper now, instinctively defensive, though he tried to mask it. "And what exactly would that be?" he asked, his voice regaining a layer of its earlier confidence, but thinner now, more fragile beneath the surface. Alexander did not look away. "The narrative you've been presenting," he said evenly. "About her." The word her carried weight. Not dismissive. Not possessive. Defined. The room stilled again, sharper this time, because everyone understood what was happening. This was no longer an exchange. This was a reveal. Daniel's jaw tightened, the reaction quick, controlled, but not fast enough to hide completely. "I'm not sure what you're implying," he said, his tone cool, measured, attempting distance. But the distance no longer held. Alexander took a single step forward. Not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to shift the dynamic again. "You told people she couldn't keep up," he said. "That she wasn't built for the life you were creating." The words were not loud, but they carried. Clean. Precise. And the room heard them. The murmurs sharpened, no longer contained to quiet speculation. Because now, the past was being brought into the present. Publicly. Daniel's expression hardened, the control returning in fragments, his posture straightening as he attempted to reclaim ground. "That was a private matter," he said, his voice tightening. "And an honest one." Emily felt the words land, but not the way they once would have. There was no sting, no fracture, just clarity. Because honesty, she had learned, was not always truth. Alexander's gaze did not waver. "No," he said calmly. It was convenient. The distinction cut deeper than any accusation. A quiet, collective intake of breath moved through the crowd. Because now, the narrative itself was being challenged. Not emotionally, structurally. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time, the words did not come easily. Because the foundation he had built, his version of events, his version of her, was no longer uncontested. It was being examined. And more importantly, it was being dismantled. Emily stepped forward then. Not dramatically, not forcefully, just enough to place herself fully within the center of the moment. No longer adjacent. No longer responding. Defining. "You didn't leave me because I couldn't keep up," she said, her voice calm, steady, carrying without effort. "You left because I stopped agreeing with you." The words landed with precision. Because they reframed everything. Not weakness. Not failure. Choice. The room shifted again, sharper now, the tension no longer building, but breaking. Daniel's composure cracked, just for a second, the realization hitting before he could contain it. Because this was not just about status. Not just about perception. This was about truth. And truth, once spoken clearly in the right room, could not be undone. Emily held his gaze. Unflinching, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something stronger. Finality. "And you needed someone who wouldn't challenge you," she continued softly. "Someone who would fit your version of success, without questioning it." The silence that followed was absolute. Because everyone understood now. The narrative had not just shifted, it had reversed. And Daniel was no longer standing at the top of it. He was standing inside it. Exposed. And for the first time that night, there was nowhere left for him to hide. The silence did not just linger. It pressed. It expanded outward, filling every corner of the ballroom until even the smallest sound fell out of place. Emily's words had not been loud, but they had done something louder than any voice could. They had rewritten the story, publicly, irreversibly. And now, everyone was adjusting to the new version. Daniel stood in the center of it, no longer controlling the narrative, but trapped inside it. His expression held, barely, the fragments of composure he had spent years perfecting. But beneath it, something was breaking. Not visibly, not dramatically, but undeniably. "That's not how it happened," he said finally, his voice controlled, but thinner now, less certain, as if even he could hear the distance between his words and the reality settling around him. It was not a denial meant to convince others. It was a reflex, a last attempt to anchor himself to a version of events that no longer held. Emily did not react immediately. She did not rush to correct him. She let the silence breathe again, let the weight of the room press against his words, testing them, measuring them, finding them lacking. Then she spoke, her tone calm, almost gentle, but carrying a clarity that cut through everything. "No," she said. That's how you told it. The distinction landed harder than anything before, because it did not attack him. It exposed him. Around them, the crowd shifted again, not in movement, but in understanding. People were no longer trying to piece together what had happened. They were recognizing it, reframing it, and more importantly, believing it. Daniel felt it. The shift from influence to scrutiny, from authority to doubt. His wife stepped forward again, but this time her movement lacked the earlier confidence. It was sharper now, defensive. "I think this is getting a little inappropriate," she said, her voice controlled, but edged with urgency. "This isn't the place for truth." Emily interrupted softly, not raised, not aggressive, but precise enough to stop the sentence before it could finish. The woman's words faltered, caught in the space between intention and reality. Because that was the problem. It was the place. That was exactly why it mattered. Emily's gaze shifted briefly to her, not dismissive, not confrontational, just clear. "You're right," she continued, her voice steady. "This isn't usually where truth gets told." The implication settled instantly. This room, the polished, curated, carefully controlled environment, was built on perception, not honesty. On image, not reality. And yet, here it was. Unavoidable. Daniel exhaled slowly, his patience thinning into something closer to frustration, his control no longer smooth, now forced. "What do you want, Emily?" he asked, the question sharper now, stripped of performance. "An apology? A public correction? What exactly is this?" There it was. The assumption that this moment had a goal he could meet, a demand he could satisfy, a resolution he could control. Emily looked at him for a long second, not with anger, not with resentment, but with something far more unsettling. "Absence. I don't want anything from you," she said quietly. And that was the break. Because for the first time, he understood. This was not a negotiation. There was nothing he could offer that would restore his position. No apology that would rebalance the room. No correction that would undo what had already shifted. The power he had once held over her was gone. Completely. And the room could see it. Feel it. Daniel's shoulders stiffened, the realization settling deeper now, heavier, harder to ignore. "Then why are you doing this?" he pressed, his voice lowering, more controlled, but edged with something raw beneath it. Emily did not hesitate. "I'm not doing anything," she said. "I just stopped protecting the version of me you created." The words landed like a final key turning in a lock. Because that version, the quiet, accommodating, invisible woman, had never been truth. It had been adaptation, survival, and she had outgrown it. Alexander stepped forward then, not to interrupt, but to finalize what had already been set in motion. His presence shifted the air again, not louder, not heavier, but more defined. He looked at Daniel, his expression calm, unwavering. "And now," he said evenly, "everyone can see the difference." The statement did not need elaboration. It did not need emphasis. Because the room was already responding to it. The difference was no longer subtle. It was visible in every glance, every recalibrated interaction, every quiet realignment of attention. Emily was no longer the woman Daniel had described. And Daniel was no longer the man the room assumed he was. The hierarchy had not just shifted, it had inverted. And the realization was settling in, layer by layer, across every person watching. Daniel's composure did not shatter. That was not his way. But it thinned. It cracked at the edges, just enough to reveal what lay beneath. Not dominance, not certainty, but something unfamiliar. Exposure. And for the first time in a long time, he had no control over how it was seen. The silence that followed was no longer fragile. It was absolute. Not the kind that waits to be broken, but the kind that settles after something has already ended. Emily could feel it in the stillness of the room, in the way no one rushed to speak, no one attempted to soften what had just been exposed. Because there was nothing left to soften. The truth had already taken its place. Daniel stood there, not collapsed, not defeated in any obvious way, but changed. The kind of change that did not show in posture, but in presence. The certainty that once defined him was gone. Not entirely, but enough. Enough for the room to notice. Enough for him to feel it. He looked at Emily, really looked this time, without defense, without narrative, without the quiet assumption that he could still define what she was. And in that moment, something settled in his expression. Not understanding. Not fully. But recognition. The kind that comes too late to change anything. I didn't see it, he said quietly. The words were not for the room. They were not even for her, entirely. They were for himself. An admission, stripped of performance. Emily held his gaze, calm, steady, untouched by the weight those words might have carried before. No, she said softly. You chose not to. The correction was gentle, but final, because not seeing implied innocence. Choice implied responsibility, and that distinction mattered. Daniel gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, as if acknowledging something he could no longer argue with. Around them, the room had shifted fully now. There was no more tension building, no? More anticipation. Just clarity. People were no longer watching to see what would happen next. They were absorbing what had already happened, rewriting what they thought they knew. Emily could feel it in the way the energy moved, no longer centered on conflict, but on resolution. Not his. Hers. Alexander's hand remained at her back, steady, grounding, but now it carried something else. Not just support. Recognition. He did not need to say anything. He did not need to claim the moment, because it already belonged to her. Daniel's wife stood slightly behind him now, no longer leading, no longer trying to redirect the narrative. Her silence was different from before. Not controlled, not strategic, just quiet. Because there was nothing left to say that would restore what had shifted. Daniel took a slow breath, his gaze lingering on Emily for a moment longer, as if searching for something he could still hold on to. But there was nothing left that belonged to him. Not her attention, not her identity, not her story. And he knew it. You've made your point, he said finally, but this time the words carried no resistance. No edge, just acceptance. Emily tilted her head slightly, the faintest trace of something softer passing through her expression. Not sympathy, not regret, just closure. No, she said. I just stopped hiding it. The difference settled between them, quiet and complete. Because this had never been about proving anything to him. It had been about no longer shrinking for him. And that was something he could not undo. Daniel nodded once more, slower this time. The movement heavier, as if something inside him had finally aligned with the reality in front of him. He did not reach for control again. He did not try to reclaim the moment. He simply stepped back. Just a fraction. But enough. Enough for the room to see it. Enough for the shift to finalize. The man who had once stood at the center had moved. And he had not been pushed. He had stepped aside. Emily felt it clearly. The last thread of the past releasing. Not with force. Not with drama. But with certainty. She turned slightly, not away from him, but forward, toward the room, toward the space that now recognized her without condition, without question. The city lights beyond the glass stretched out endlessly, no longer distant, no longer unreachable. They reflected. Back at her now. Part of her world again. Or maybe, a world she had finally claimed for herself. Alexander moved with her, not leading, not guiding, just aligned, his presence steady beside hers as the room slowly began to breathe again. Conversations returning, but different now. Softer, more aware. Because something had shifted tonight. Something that would not be undone when the music faded and the lights dimmed. Emily did not look back. She did not need to. Because the version of her that once stood behind him no longer existed. And the woman who walked forward now belonged to no one's narrative but her own. And for the first time, that was more than enough.